What if you could lead more effectively and go home on time? Welcome to the Lightbulb. I'm Zoe Thompson, leadership and performance coach, and each week I bring you 3 practical insights from my work helping impact-driven leaders transform from reactive to intentional leadership so they can finish work on time and take guilt-free time off, creating success that feels as good as it looks. Let's jump in. Welcome back to the Lightbulb, episode 16. Now we know math is not my strong point, so I'm not going to work out how many light bulbs I have talked about to date so far, but it's really interesting that every week there's 3 new light bulbs. And even when I'm talking about the same topics, just talking about them from different angles. And this week is no different. Now, again, less client work this week. I've had a few personal commitments, which has meant I have been out of the office in the afternoons quite a few days this week. That's how it goes sometimes, right? Sometimes we do a full week and it's a Monday to Friday, and sometimes life outside of work needs our attention. And this week has been one of those weeks. So I've had a call with the alumni from the Elevate Your Efficiency program. This is our monthly call where we all get together. We talk about what's been working really well for them, how they are continuing to implement what they've learned on the program, and then an opportunity for them to ask questions, gain support with anything that they are working on at the moment. It's really important for me that, especially when I'm working with somebody, whether it's the 8-week program or whether it's through one-to-one coaching over a period of time, my journey with you doesn't end when the coaching finishes or the program finishes. I am here as a continual support for people. It's great to be able to have these workshops so that people can drop in, they can ask questions, and they can get that support, as well as the accountability of keeping things going. And actually, that's something that somebody mentioned in the workshop this week. They hadn't noticed that certain old habits and behaviors were slipping back into place until they started prepping for our workshop, thinking about what it was they wanted to talk about, what they wanted support with, when they realized that, okay, some of the old things were starting to slip. So the momentum is important, but that accountability is really important as well. And actually, the first light bulb for this week was talking about the old habits slipping back in and really understanding what is the underlying trigger to the problem. Now, it's really important that we get to the root cause. If we are always looking at solving the problem at a surface level, that's as far as it gets, which means it's going to keep coming up in different ways. So it's really important that we do strip it all back and we get to the root cause. So what is the underlying trigger problem? And the conversation that we had was, why are we still working evenings? Despite knowing better, despite having put things in place, despite looking at some of the things that we could do from routine, through structure, through behaviors that would reduce the need to do that. And this is what we talked about in the alumni meetings. On the 8-week program, this is what we're looking at. Focus is on how we can be more efficient, more effective as leaders so that we can go home on time, so that we don't have to work weekends, so that we have this confident, empowered team that can run the show while we take a week off and go and enjoy a holiday away from the grey skies and the rain here in the UK and go somewhere warm, somewhere sunny, and completely switch off for a week without having to log on and check in that everybody's okay, without having to answer emails because people have got questions for us. So it's not just about a structure in place that means you go home on time. We're looking at how you can be more efficient and more effective as a leader so that you go home on time, but you're actually becoming a better leader in the process. So we talked about this in the meeting. This client shared that there were lots of improvements. Team was making improvements, much better organization, new recruitment, bringing new people in, and understanding, or certainly recognizing, that some of the old habits were slipping back in. And that is how things work. We have this neurological pathway of all of these old habits and behaviors. And it's hard. It's hard to bring these new habits and behaviors in. We need to be consistent. We need that repetition to build a new neurological pathway, which means it then becomes our new pattern of behavior. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to give it energy. We don't have to give it attention. But we do have to be consistent, and we do have to practice it consistently for that to become permanent. And so one of the things that we talked about in the session this week was, okay, we know what we should be doing. We know that. There's no denying that. We know what we want to do. We know that we have frameworks in place that will help us to do that. We know that we've got some boundaries that we have set, but we do need to keep them protected consistently. The boundaries are really important. Having that framework to use is important. Having a structure and a routine is important as well. However, until we change the belief that drives those behaviors, the framework, the structures, the boundaries need our attention. They need our energy for us to continue to show up and make them happen. So we need to make sure we get to the root cause, the underlying trigger, understanding what is going on. When we work on that, when we work on the belief, we don't need to keep managing the symptoms. We can identify and remove the trigger. Now, the analogy that popped into my mind when we were talking about this in the week with the domino analogy, which you might have heard me talk about. Now, when we're talking about bringing in new habits and behaviors, what's the first domino we need to knock down that helps to put everything else to fall into place? Now, if we are doing the reverse of that and we are trying to stop something from happening, we need to understand, firstly, what is the domino that is being knocked over that is making everything else fall into place? So what is that trigger? But also, how do we put distance between what is happening and what we are trying to stop from happening? What's the trigger? How do we remove the trigger? How do we remove to put that gap in so that it stops this pattern of behavior from happening? And especially when you know that I use it in terms of creating good new habits, understanding that actually taking away that domino that knocks everything else down can also help us to stop old patterns of behavior that are no longer useful to us. I want you to think about how you can take something away to help remove the trigger that is creating a chain of events or a chain of habits and behaviors that you no longer want. This is going to help you to move away from trying to resolve this at a surface level and start to work on this at the root cause. It's not a surface level problem. There's a root cause. And if you're only ever working on the symptoms and you're not working on the root cause, it is going to keep coming back. And this is what happens. Most overwhelmed leaders are managing symptoms. They're trying to get a better calendar system. They're trying to find more efficient ways to process their work, their systems, automations, delegation. They focus in on having stronger boundaries to protect what's really important. All of these are important. They're good things to have in place. But if the trigger is still there, the button is still being pressed, then you are likely to still have the same outcome, especially when you are under pressure. So if you're tired, stressed, it's a busy period, you are going to go right back to that old pattern because that neurological pathway is stronger. So until we are consistent with these new habits, these new behaviors, until we build a new, stronger neurological pathway, it's going to keep happening. So we want to make sure we are getting to the root cause, not managing the symptoms, identifying the triggers and working from there. Okay, light bulb number 2. I suspect that this is going to resonate with a lot of you, which is why I think it's really important to talk about because it's a common challenge. And that's the fear of rejection. So we know, again, going back to how our brain works, we know that our brain is hardwired for self-protection and self-preservation. Now, in this day and age, it's not necessarily life and death, but it is fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of judgment. And fear of rejection can come up in lots of different ways. And it's not necessarily linked to your confidence. It's not necessarily linked to your self-worth and to your value. It comes up in a number of ways. But actually, it's also why we hold ourselves in a safe space. We don't step out of the comfort zone. We don't step out of what's familiar. We don't step out of where we know we are accepted and we belong because we fear rejection, we fear judgment, and we fear failure. It's really important to recognize when we are noticing that this pops up. Because if we're not actively stepping outside of our comfort zone because we fear failure and rejection, we wait until we're invited. We wait until somebody, quite often our own line manager, stands on the other side and says, "You'd be really good at that," and invites you into this new space. However, we're going to miss out on so many opportunities if we wait for that invitation. If we are waiting for people to invite us to meet our full potential, and we're not proactively doing that, we're going to miss out on so much. We need to advocate for ourselves. And I actually talked about this in an earlier episode when I talked about how we can't just let our work speak for itself. We have to go out there and tell people what we're able to do, tell people what we're good at. But also, we need to tell people what it is that we want. So if you're driven, determined, and you know that there are certain opportunities that you would love to have, and you would love to be able to take part in a project, or you would love to be able to do an attachment with a different department, or you would love to be able to cover your boss when they go on holiday, you need to let them know. Now, what that does mean is that is firstly, you pushing yourself outside of the comfort zone. Secondly, you are opening yourself up for judgment, for rejection, and for failure. And you put yourself there. So it's really important. And I think it's worth thinking about where you are keeping yourself safe rather than proactively pushing yourself out there because you fear for that rejection, because you recognize that actually asking for something and then getting it turned down feels very different to being in the mix with other people and those decisions being made. But if we don't ask for it, people don't know. And if people don't know, then they can't take that into consideration. So self-advocacy is really important, even at senior levels. And it's a leadership skill. Believing that you've got the right to pursue what it is that you actually want is so important. Fear does mean sometimes it's easier to accept what's offered than to pursue what you want. But that's not intentional leadership. It's not intentional self-leadership. And it means that you are living and working based on the decisions of other people, rather than actively pursuing what is important to you and being intentional about pursuing what you want, where you put your time, where you put your energy. And sometimes saying it out loud is it's a real thing. And I get it. I totally get it. And in the conversation with the client, I shared some of the things that I have also been working on because, like I said, this is a common challenge. And it's one thing to have somebody knock on your door and offer you an opportunity. It is something very different to go knocking on doors and asking for opportunities. And that is often fear of rejection that we don't do that. So that's a bit of a challenge to think about where you might do that. Where can you be a little bit vulnerable? Step into that courage of going out there and seeking the opportunities that align with what is important to you and what you want and where you want to go, rather than waiting for other people to offer those opportunities for you and create that path for you. So this is not uncommon, and it doesn't stop just when you start achieving. It doesn't stop when you get to a certain level of leadership. Self-advocacy, self-promotion is a challenge for a lot of people. And so what we tend to do is we prove ourselves through competence, through our delivery, through saying yes to all of the different opportunities that come up, rather than being more intentional and go out and specifically seek the opportunities that we want, having that courage to pursue it, having the courage and the vulnerability to ask for it and articulate what it is that we want, and being able to negotiate it. Those communication skills, being very clear in what we're asking for and being very clear in what good looks like. What is it that we want? How do we want it? Why do we want it? All of that is really important. We don't want to accept what's offered when it's something else that we want. Okay, third light bulb, fear of change and how that becomes the bottleneck. So a client session this week talking about making some big decisions in their line of work and how they had a number of concerns that these changes, whilst they would be hugely beneficial to the growth of their area of the business, would potentially be uncomfortable, be difficult, be a challenge, or be unwanted by staff, and recognizing that they're in a really good position, great staff, great culture, great work being done. And that's the question, isn't it? If we start to change things, are we going to lose people who are really good? If this is the best team you've ever had, then the fear of that getting lost in the change often means that we hold back on those changes because we fear what might happen as a result of that growth. Now, this is the challenge between the logical decision making and the emotional decision making. The logical decision is very clear. This is what we need to do if we want to grow the business, if we want to advance, if we want changes to be sustainable, if we want that evolution, we have to change. The emotional decision is, how is everyone going to respond to that? How will people cope with that? What is good right now that might change if we start to make these changes? And that fear of change can then often become the bigger obstacle than the actual change itself. And we want to keep things protected. We want to keep things the same. Now, what we talked about in the session and the light bulb through this is actually recognizing that having a really good structure doesn't restrict change. Often it can really help people to move through the change, because when we communicate what's changing, we also need to communicate what is staying the same. And people need stability to anchor themselves through transition. When we're communicating what is going to change, there will always be unknowns. There will always be uncertainty. However, there will also be lots of things that aren't changing. So where we can communicate that to our teams and we can tell them and give them that sense of guarantee and therefore stability that certain things will not change. And if you can put a time period on it and say, look, for at least the next 6 months, this is not going to change. We're not going to make any changes to personnel. We're not going to make any changes to wages or your working hours or the role that you are working in. We're not going to change any major ways of working. Then you give them that structure and you give them that security in that stability that they know that certain things are not going to change, which then can often help people to be more willing to accept some of the changes that are happening. And it doesn't feel like that free fall. It feels more managed. It feels more structured. It feels more like it's a step by step. This is what's going to happen. And actually, within all of this, none of this stuff over here is going to change. So change is a constant. And we know that businesses or teams within businesses need to change. We need that constant evolution. And especially with how quickly the world is changing now, we probably do need to make more changes than perhaps organizations needed to do 20 years ago. Technology is changing, environments are changing, people are changing. So we do need to change. We do need that continual evolution to keep businesses and organizations successful. So the change is the constant, and change is very real, but it also can feel very uncertain for people. And with that uncertainty there comes fear. And the fear is the challenge that we in our leadership need to help manage. So change isn't the enemy. Uncontained change is the enemy. So structure helps to give us that control over how the change happens. And that also allows us to protect what matters and only evolving what needs to evolve rather than that whirlwind of bringing everything else into it. So I know through conversations with other people that I'm working with at the moment, there are lots of leaders trying to manage changes within their business, within their organizations. So I'm hoping that sharing this is helpful to those of you who are working through change. I also want you to think about where your avoidance of change actually is becoming more of a bottleneck, and that maybe some of the things that I have talked about here will help you to be able to do that. And think about where you can anchor your team during that change. What is not going to change that you can clearly communicate with them that will help give them that sense of stability and security? Yes, there will always be unknowns. Yes, there will always be uncertainty. There's also going to be a whole lot of stuff that isn't going to change for them. So those are the 3 light bulbs for this week. I hope there are certain things in there that resonate with you and help you to think about what you might be working on in your role at the moment. As always, feel free to ask if you have any questions at all. I am more than happy to answer. You do not need to be a client of mine to ask a question for something that you are hearing about on this podcast. If I have resources, I will send them to you. If you want to book in a coaching call to talk this through, we can do that too. But you do not need to be a client of mine to ask questions about the topics that come up in these episodes. Feel free to reach out. Comment, pop me a message. I will be more than happy to answer. I'm recording these because I think the work that I am doing is going to be helpful to those that are listening. And this is a great way to be able to do that. But it will raise questions for you. So if you have questions, feel free to message me and ask. Have a great week ahead, and I will see you next week for the next episode. And those are your 3 takeaways for this week. Before you go, ask yourself, what's my light bulb moment from this? And now that I know what I know, what will I do differently? Choose one action, however small, and commit to it. That's how overwhelmed and reactive becomes aligned and intentional. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week on the next episode of The Lightbulb.